Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that a quiet, studious investigator with a taste for order is about to be cast into the center of a storm he never imagined, his name smeared across headlines as a recipient of dirty money, his home life corroding, and the men he thought he could trust standing with their palms clean while they pulled the strings that could snap his life in halves. Jacob had built his career on a ledger of small truths, paper trails, timestamps, the little inconsistencies that, when strung one after another, made a rope strong enough to drag down men who thought themselves too big to fall. He liked the world when it was neat. He liked to imagine that evidence was a kind of justice that, when presented clearly, would bend outcomes toward fairness. That tidy faith began to fray on a Tuesday when Naomi's fingers trembled over his phone as she scrolled through a news push alert that had the cruel geometry of inevitability. The headline announced a scandal with Jacob's name in it, an image of a bank transfer, a cropped photograph apparently showing him accepting an envelope, and a ledger screenshot annotated by an anonymous whistleblower. The story called it a smoking gun. Payments from Joey Armstrong's shadow companies into an account tied to Jacob. Naomi looked up, and the look she gave him contained a calculus he could not read entirely. A look that, for a husband, feels like falling through thin ice. The dossier had been surgical in its fabrication. Whoever assembled it had anticipated the exact forensic traces reporters would demand: transaction IDs, timestamps, a convincing narrative of motive. It was the work of someone who knew not just how banks logged money but how small newspapers treated scandal, how they would favor the simple condemnation above the messy work of context. Within hours the local feeds repeated the forged evidence like lit candles, and the social undercurrent that sustained the town's sense of safety began to murmur with questions that felt like accusations. Jacob, at first, moved like a man who believed the law would be his ally. He sat at his desk and sketched out a plan like any good detective: validate sources, confirm the provenance of the screenshots, subpoena the bank for raw files, interview the journalist who published the piece. But the world outside his tidy routine had teeth ready to bite. Naomi's voice in his ear was small and brittle. "Did you?" she began, and then stopped, as if the question itself could open a wound that would not close. Her hesitation was the kind of human punctuation that left him more exposed than any headline could. He did not sleep that night. He sat with spreadsheets and court precedents and his memories of the meeting he had attended 6 months earlier, when as an undercover investigator he had staged a sting and observed a transaction that, in the right hands, could be turned into a conviction. He had been there on purpose. He had watched the flow of money and recorded it, the way a scientist records a phenomenon. He had never intended to touch the money. He had not taken it. He had documented. But the editing of reality is a fine art, and someone with a skill for narrative could cut that footage to make it appear as if he were at the center of the very corruption he had been tracking. The moral problem was complex and felt like a living, breathing animal beside him. He had witnessed, he had been the witness, and the raw video was, in one sense, the most damning thing of all. It showed him at a table where Joey's messenger counted bills and pushed a folded packet across the wood. But Jacob's camera had angled in a way that included his investigative badge in the periphery. The audio recorded him murmuring, "Document the handoff, get the serials." Those minute details mattered in court. They mattered in the mind of someone who could read context. Yet in the version that had gone viral, the staccato edits removed the badge, excised the whispering directive, and left the image of a man receiving cash, a clean, cinematic piece of guilt. Naomi considered leaving. She did not say it out loud, but she rearranged their lives as if bracing for rupture. She began to gather documents from their home office, files that could be used to place Jacob in financial specificity. She scanned their joint account statements for signs of withdrawal. She stopped answering calls from friends and began to sleep on the couch, as if distance could function as a firewall. The erosion of trust happened in small, domestic gestures: Naomi's coldness at the dinner table when he arrived late from the precinct, the way she refused to kiss him before bed. For Jacob, the domestic betrayals stung sharper than any public accusation. He ran scenarios like the old cases he loved to solve: prove the dossier is fake, or show reasonable doubt. He piled up technical tasks and attempted to make them into a fortress. He requested the bank's raw feeds with urgent subpoenas, asked for cell tower logs for the day in question, and obtained metadata from the device used to film the handoff. Behind each legal request, there was the knowledge that for every day the dossier circulated unchecked, political will and public sentiment would tilt against him. Prosecutors are as sensitive to headlines as anyone. A sparkling narrative of corruption can make them impatient for conviction. But Jacob's world was more complicated than the neat categories of law and illicitness. He was not merely being framed, he had been an involuntary participant in scenes that, when removed from context, looked like bribes. He had been trained to put himself at risk to obtain evidence. He had been in rooms where the currency used by men like Joey functioned more like ritual than economy. He had seen money change hands in parking lots, in the back rooms of strip malls, in the private offices of men whose public images were pristine. Those scenes had been collected as evidence, but the manipulation of that evidence into an accusation against him had been exact. The deeper shock for Jacob, beyond the headline and Naomi's retreat, was discovering the bank account named in the forged ledger, Marcel's account. Marcel, known locally as the smooth, generationally powerful figure who handled municipal development deals and ran one of the region's largest property management firms, had always moved with the unseen grace of someone used to making decisions happen without a spectacle. To find Marcel's numbers intersecting with Joey's was to discover that the net of influence contained more holes than Jacob had guessed. Marcel was not simply a businessman, he was an architect of networks. A man who did favors and collected favors in a way that had once seemed invisible to the law. Jacob's discovery did not happen by happenstance. He had been following a side thread in the money laundering pattern, a set of transactions that moved through real estate purchases, through layered shell companies, and then into smaller, more mundane accounts. The fingerprints of laundering were repetitive and almost boring in their method. A small payment labeled as consultation, another labeled land improvement, a third labeled transfer for services. The sums were not always large, their meaning came from the pattern. When Jacob traced the wires further, he found an account registered in a corporate shell with Marcel's company listed as beneficiary. The same account had, in recent months, shown transfers that matched Joey's known disbursements. When Jacob brought his findings to his superior, the man smiled in the way people smile when they are confident their calendars have prepared them for this exact moment. That smile was Marcel's, but the man before him was Marcel's messenger, slick, persuasive, the sort who could deliver complicity without seeming to touch the wheel. "We can't pursue this without jeopardizing a lot," the man said, using the bureaucratic language of caution. He advised Jacob to proceed carefully, to leave certain leads unpursued until the larger operation had been mapped out. But there was a caveat in the words, a tone that implied that, for reasons Jacob did not yet understand, Marcel's name should be handled like a fragile artifact. Naomi's suspicions deepened when an anonymous tipster sent her a copy of the original ledger, or what the public was told was original, and she saw, embedded in the mock-up, a file name that matched one Jacob had stored on a work laptop and that occasionally synced to their home network for backup. The coincidence felt damning. She confronted him with a voice that trembled between hurt and accusation. "Was this on your computer?" she demanded. Jacob's answers felt like walking on glass. He could explain that the file had been a copy used for analysis, that his notation on the corner showed investigative markings. He could explain that sometimes, to make patterns visible, investigators create reproductions. But Naomi's mind, bruised by betrayal, required not legalese but moral clarity. Elon, Jacob's father, loomed in this drama like a weathered but trusted figure. A man who had served in municipal office and who still held a measure of authority in town meetings even in his less formal, quieter retirement. Elon had been the kind of father who taught Jacob to read documents like maps. But Elon also belonged to an older generation of protectionism, the idea that families shield their own, that reputations are stewardship as much as they are inheritance. When Jacob approached him with the Marcel account details, expecting a father to help untangle the web, what he received instead was a hand that instructed gentleness. "Go slow, son, Elon advised in the dim kitchen where they had shared countless late-night arguments about right and wrong. You don't see what I see. Not everything that's ugly will look the same if you drag it into the light. There are debts we don't understand and people who would use this to burn down more than one house. The warning implied that Elon had weighed the consequences of exposure and found them too heavy to bear. The revelation that Elon was hiding knowledge or at least was reluctant to proceed felt like a betrayal to Jacob. He had never imagined the man who raised him to be a negotiator of silence. The discovery of an offshore account had made everything personal: the family, the town, the law. Jacob's career, which had always rested on a belief that evidence could be neutral and declarative, started to look like a set of strings that, when pulled, might unravel his family as surely as it could bring down a corrupt network. Jacob's inner conflict was sharp and visceral. On the one hand, he had sworn an oath to a profession that valued truth. On the other, he watched the seams of his marriage tearing, Naomi retreating into suspicion, and his father suggesting concealment. Every choice he made would have consequences, both professional and intimate. Expose Marcel and the account, and by extension, implicate Elon, and he might protect the town from corruption but lose his family. Do nothing and he would betray his oath and his own sense of self. The geometry of this decision was a cruelty. It was a moral Rubik's Cube with sides that refused to align. The pressure increased when phantom legal threats materialized. A subpoena for Jacob's own past cases appeared, demanding records and depositions. The fabricated ledger had been attached to an anonymous complaint filed with a local magistrate, and the magistrate, human and fallible, had reissued the complaint as a preliminary finding that justified an inquiry into Jacob's conduct. The process felt like a legal noose that tightened with bureaucratic efficiency. Jacob felt the unique terror of a man whose toolkit was designed for others and who now had to deploy that toolkit to defend himself. Marcel, when Jacob finally confronted him with the evidence and the moral plea, did not react with denial so much as with a calm impatience. "You are not seeing the wider picture," he said, as if instructing a junior in the art of municipal stewardship. Marcel's tone implied not innocence, but the confidence of someone who believed he could orchestrate the town's balance sheet for the greater good, a paternalism that dressed self-interest in the costume of civic necessity. "You think your evidence is conclusive. You think that if you take this to the press or to the court you will be the hero. But a town cannot afford a public bloodletting. There are projects that feed people, jobs that are fragile. You cannot be naive." When Jacob persisted, Marcel's face cooled. He offered a different kind of pressure, a direct order to stand down. "This is not your fight yet," Marcel said. "We have arrangements. Some of those arrangements benefit people you care about." He did not specify which people, but the implication was clear enough: speak and the arrangement ends. The fallout will not be contained to theory. Marcel's language was a non-violent coercion, the sort that relies on plausible deniability and the social capital of a man who had built alliances across decades. Complicating matters further was Jacob's discovery of indicia in Vanessa's real estate company records. He had, in quieter moments between crisis management, followed a breadcrumb trail: property deals that had unusual capitalization, shell LLCs layered between developer and buyer, short-term flips that created the perfect cover for laundering. The patterns suggested that Vanessa's company had, knowingly or not, been used in the flow of tainted funds. The fact that this company was public and front-facing gave the laundering plausible deniability under the law. Jacob knew the technical work to expose such a network: trace the beneficial owners, follow the money through intermediary accounts, subpoena corporate records, and compel testimony from directors. But that would require resources, time, and an institutional will he was beginning to realize he lacked. Before Jacob could marshal the resources, before he could issue subpoenas that might bite into the hidden veins of wealth, he was blocked. Marcel, who indirectly held sway over the investigatory office's political capital, ordered him to cease active tracing into Vanessa's holdings. "We cannot pursue private companies without probable cause," he said, citing legal prudence. The phrasing was correct in a narrow sense. The intention, Jacob suspected, was obstruction. Marcel's order was not framed as a command to protect criminal enterprise but rather as a bureaucratic reality, a way of turning the gears of process into a protective shell. Jacob's resistance to the order set him on a collision course with men who had the power to ruin him. He felt the old rhythms of a prosecutor's office shift. Colleagues who once exchanged coffees with him now adjusted their chairs when he entered the room. A friend at the lab would delay returning call-outs for forensic analysis with a softness that tasted like fear. He was increasingly isolated, a single node in a network of forces aligned against him. Meanwhile, Naomi's silence at home had become a public whisper, and her potential departure felt imminent. Marcel, it eventually emerged through the nervous whispers of a clerk in an adjacent office, was not acting alone. There were ties tightly held between Marcel and Joey and with Bill, a civic elder whose philanthropic projects had long masked a desire for influence. The collaboration was not a triangular conspiracy so much as a web of mutual dependencies. Joey had money and muscle, Marcel had access and cover, Bill had social legitimacy and a reputation that could be used as a buffer. Together, they formed a buffer against prying eyes. Jacob realized that he was not simply up against one man but the combined craft of 3 seasoned operators who knew how to make the legal apparatus serve their needs, not the other way around. That realization did not make him passive. It made him accurate and purposeful to the point of danger. He plotted contingencies with a kind of cold clarity he used in the field, back up raw data on air-gapped drives, make hard copies of critical bank statements, distribute copies to secure, anonymous wallets outside the immediate jurisdiction. He recruited a friend in cyber forensics who owed him a favor to hash and timestamp documents in multiple jurisdictions. Every act of preparation felt like a small victory against an invisible tide. Then, in the small hours of a rain-heavy Thursday, an email arrived with an attachment that made Jacob's breath catch. It contained a single recorded call, not part of his original evidence, between a person with Marcel's voice and an unseen correspondent, where the phrase "cover and payment" occurred within the first 30 seconds. The call was raw, the voices muffled by distance and the hiss of a poor line, but the content was crystalline. There was talk of keeping things quiet, of channeling funds in ways that looked clean, and of paying off a few in the magistrate's office if necessary. The recording suggested collusion that was intentional and strategic and involved not just bribery but the corrupt manipulation of administrative processes. Jacob listened in his car, the recording on his phone, and the rain smudging his mood into a watercolor of resolve and dread. He understood now that the stakes were higher than career or headlines. This was about the town's moral architecture and his place within it. He didn't yet know how to present the call so it would be admissible, nor did he know whether his father, Elon, had deeper knowledge than he had admitted. But the call offered a path forward, a blade he could use to cut the threads of the conspiracy. He dialed Naomi to tell her he had evidence that would clear his name and strike at the men who had forced him into silence. Her voicemail answered. He left a message with a deliberate voice, requesting that she meet him at a cafe they used to frequent before their world bent toward the public. He hoped love could still be a bridge. He also feared that making any move would be the exact lever that would make the men lining up to protect themselves act in a manner that would confirm his worst fears. As he drove, the town's venerable buildings passing like so many witnesses, Jacob felt the weight of the ledger of choices pile on his shoulders. He had put wheels in motion. He had copies of data scattered, allies whispered to, and the icy knowledge that for the first time in his life his own files might be used to gaslight him into prison. He thought of Joey, of Marcel, of Bill, of his father and Naomi, and of the small child who might grow up in a town where adults traded reputations like currency. He knew the law could be used either as remedy or as weapon. He also knew that this was no longer just about applying statutes. It was about outwitting men who had learned to hide in plain sight. Approaching the cafe, Jacob's phone vibrated. A single line of text, no sender, no header, "We know what you're doing. Stop now." The words were brief, the punctuation austere, but their menace was crystalline. He looked up at the streetlight and saw a black SUV pause at the corner, engine idling like a beast sizing up its prey. The city had taught him to notice small things, and these were small things that filled him with a new type of danger. He looked at the window seat where Naomi might sit, the place where they had once shared steaming coffee and plans for vacations they never took, and felt the slow, unstoppable drop toward choices that would either destroy his family or the corrupt architecture that threatened it. He swallowed and pushed open the door, the bell chiming like a single hollow note. Inside, the cafe was half empty, the barista washing a cup in slow, methodical circles. He chose a seat that offered an escape route, his back to the wall, eyes on the door. He opened his laptop, cued the file that contained the recording, and hit a key with a trembling finger. The screen glowed like the face of a small, relentless oracle. He was one move from exposure, one move from salvation, and the knowledge that three men, Joey, Marcel, and Bill, were waiting with nets of their own to catch whatever he tossed into the town's air.